Welcome back from lunch. We're a couple minutes late getting started because of IT challenges that have now been resolved. I'm really excited to spend the next hour talking about the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. One of my favorite little corners of state government. So we have the report up on our page, and Cameron Wood is going to take us through it with Matt Barrowitz. Okay, great. Come on up. You're welcome to grab that second chair. And do you have a presentation for us, or are we just going through the report? Okay.
Just going to walk through the report. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Cameron Wood. I am the Policy and Legislative Affairs Director for the Department of Labor. I also serve as the Unemployment Insurance Director for the department, and I have served in that capacity for coming up on 7 years.
And it feels like 15 or?
It feels like a lot longer than 7. Yes, ma'am. With me?
Good afternoon. I'm Matt Barrowitz, Economic and Labor Market Information Director for the Vermont Department of Labor. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. So annually, we at the Department of Labor present an unemployment insurance trust fund report to kind of provide the General Assembly with, the overall state and health of the unemployment insurance trust fund. And that report goes to House Commerce, House Ways and Means, Senate Economic Development, and Senate Finance. And so we provided that report last Tuesday, I believe, and we're here to present on that. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to kind of kick us off and walk through the majority of the report, and then happy to get into deep discussion with the committee here.
Great. Again, thank you for having us, and certainly hope this is a dialogue. So feel free to interrupt as we're going through this. There's a lot of technical terms, federal terms, and just want to make sure that we're going through it in a comprehensive way. So I think even right in the introduction, it gives me an opportunity to say, though I'm a state employee, me and my division are basically 100% federally funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. The bulk of our money comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to collect, compile, and release economic data with for the state of Vermont, consistent with federal methodology, so that when you're looking at information about the Vermont economy, it's the same and comparable to the 50 states plus the 4 territories that are part of the U.S. data network. We do get a small pot of money from the Employment and Training Administration within the U.S. Department of Labor. They give us money to have a website, to do partnerships, to do outreach, presentations, to be here today, as well as to produce reports like this. And it is through the Employment and Training Administration they give us technical support in the form of a unemployment insurance trust fund forecasting model. And what is interesting about where we are in this time period, this snapshot of life, is that the COVID recession was so disruptive that that model is not functioning correctly right now, because the sensitivity of that model was beyond anything we'd experienced. To give you, to put it in context, during the Great Recession at any one point, we almost hit 7% unemployment. 25,000 Vermonters being unemployed. During the COVID recession, we hit nearly 15% unemployment. And at any given one time, we were working with nearly 100,000 Vermonters at the Vermont Department of Labor, administering some sort of federal benefit. So the scale is so different. So nonetheless, I've been in my position 12 years through. I'm a state employee. I'm not an exempt employee. So this is under third administration that I've worked with under the commissioner. So I have a little bit of experience as it stands to running this model and building these things out. So I feel good about the forecasts that we have here today, particularly as it relates to the stability of the fund. And that's what we'll get into today. So in that brief intro, I also covered the technical notes, which covered the fact that, we are kind of using a hybrid model. We're using some of the statistical model that we can, and then we're using outside local modeling tools and information. So questions there? Otherwise, we're going to jump into where we are in terms of unemployment insurance. Okay. I'd like to start actually, if possible, before going through the summary of the UI changes, switching actually to page 9, because there's a graph there that really tells the story of where this trust fund has been. So I'm looking at the UI trust fund net balance, 1999 to 2022. And so what this is the cash available in our unemployment insurance trust fund to pay unemployment insurance benefits. So this is in millions of dollars, and it gives a nice story of kind of what has happened in these 20 plus years, where you start in 1999, where you see there's a slight increase in the fund, and then you get into 2001. We do have an economic downturn in 2000, early 2000s. So you expect the fund to come down during economic bad times, and you expect the fund to rise during economic good times. But you'll notice as the economy improved from that 2001 recession, 2002, 2003, 2004, you see the trust fund continuing to go down. And that was because of the way legislative policies, public policies, everything came together in a way that even though we were in good economic times where you make hay while the sun is shining kind of mentality, you're supposed to be socking away. If you're doing well from an income standpoint, you should be saving more. However, at that time, benefits were indexing up and contributions were being held flat. Because everything we're going to talk about sounds really complicated, and that's why I'm excited to be in this committee today. But there is nothing complicated about the trust fund compared to all the other things you're focused on in this committee, right? We're talking about contributions that employers pay into a fund in the event that an employee is eligible for unemployment insurance should they become separated through no fault of their own. So money comes in through employer contributions, essentially a form of payroll tax, and benefits come out. So even during those good economic times of 2002 through 2008, you could see the fund going down. We get to 2007, and that's known as the Great Recession, and because of its depth and length that it took. So that was a big hit. And so going into that recession, we were in kind of wobbly terms because we were already not cash positive. And that's what led to us exhausting the fund in 2008, ultimately in 2009, exhausting the fund, ultimately borrowing money in 2010, 2011, borrowing money from the federal government, which we pay interest on. And then, but there was so the conversations had been had up until that point. And this is actually about where I got hired. I got hired in 2010. So I walked in the door and was handed what I call an economic, or like I like to say, an economic recovery. I came in and the economy started improving. How did that happen, right? No, so 2010. So a lot of conversations had been had up until that point, and so the groundwork was laid. So big legislative changes were made at that time period to help adjust, how the fund becomes solvent again. And we try and not use that term solvent because that's actually like an actuarial term. We try and use an adequacy as the term the federal government prefers in a lot of ways, though even they will jump back and forth. It's like an adequacy. We try and have an adequate fund amount. And really the big changes that came out of there were some suspensions of benefit increases, but predominantly what it was is trying to get contributions caught up to a level where they thought that would be beneficial to the fund long term. And you can see we actually came out of that recession very strong and much quicker than anticipated. And if you look at 2013 forward, you can see how fast, much quicker than anticipated, how fast the money was coming into the fund, ultimately getting to a point where we had $500 million in the fund in 2019. At that point in time, Vermont was considered one of the healthiest funds in the country, tiptoeing around first or second. And that's what we walked into when we came into the COVID. So as far as when we started the COVID downturn, you couldn't ask for a healthier fund at that time. And I'll just pause there, see if Cam has things to say or questions.
The one thing I'll just add is if you're, if anyone in the room or anyone who's listening is interested in what was done around the time of the Great Recession to help us come out of that, there is a summary in the report. If you go back to, I think it starts, on page, was it 2 or 3, Matt? We do list a little bit of a summary of what the legislature did in order to try to get us back into the positive trajectory that you can see on the graph Matt was just referencing. Yeah.
And my memory from the Unemployment Insurance Task Force last year was that we were one of only a couple states that actually did not go into the negative during the pandemic because of the
Yes.
health,
Adequacy.
adequacy of our trust fund.
Yeah, true. I think we actually pointed out,
I think it was 30 states either had to borrow or put money into their trust fund through some federal source that they received during the pandemic period, whether through CRF dollars or otherwise. We were one of the few states that did not have to do either.
correct. Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things I was just looking back at recent history. Recent is when you were hired, but the first sentence is between 2000 and 2010 before you were hired. Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong. My recollection, and this goes to the, if you like, ebb and flow of attitudes about the fund. There was considerable pressure from the contributing community to reduce contributions for quite a stretch. And the sentence doesn't say what's the contributing factor. It uses language like the debits exceeded the credits, but not explaining where that came from. Could you confirm that?
I can speak generally to that in that there is no guidance from the federal government on how much money we should have in this fund, right? They provide ratios and things to say, this is where we'd like to see you. Some states as a public policy say, hey, if we have $1 in the account, we don't want to tax any more than we have to in terms of the employer or contributing community. In Vermont, we'd like to have the public policy, again, change. My understanding, at least in the last decade, has been that the public policy has been we want a rainy day fund to ensure that there's adequacy in the fund to pay benefits and not have to borrow. But to your point, I don't know what the prevailing wisdom was at the time between 2000 and 2010 about the overall public policy sentiment of how much is a healthy fund? How much should we have?
The only thing I would add to that is, and I was not in the state of Vermont at that time, so I do not know what the kind of conversation was either from the employer community, from the department, or the General Assembly during that period. But I would say the contributions were remaining flat in the sense that the taxable wage base was set at $8,000. It did not go up. It did not go down. So again, for the committee, for those listening, when you're raising contributions from employers, there are essentially 2 levers that can influence the amount of money that we can bring in. It's the tax rates that we set. So we have 5 different schedules, 1 through 5, 5 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. We are currently at tax rate schedule 1, which is the lowest. The second kind of lever we can use to increase the amount of contributions or decrease is the taxable wage base, which is the amount of taxable wages that employers will pay their tax rate on. And so during that period leading up into the Great Recession, the taxable wage base was at $8,000. So I don't know if there was pressure from the employer community to keep it at that level as opposed to increasing it. Very well could be the case. I was not in the state of Vermont.
But Chair Marcotte, who was Representative Marcotte and not a chair then, was part of that reconfiguring and is very happy to talk to any members about it anytime. There's a lot of pride that we have a solvent fund now. Yeah.
The 8,000 is what? The 8,000, is that a dollars or?
$8,000. It's the taxable wage base is the first. So at that point in time, it was 8,000. The first 8,000 that an employer pays an employee, that is what they would pay their unemployment tax rate on. So once they pay the 8,000 to us, any wages paid to the employee after that would not be taxed for unemployment insurance purposes.
Okay.
And the taxable wage base is currently set at 13,500. So,
Yeah. And for the full history it is on page 3. There is a little chart showing the taxable wage base. And as Cam indicated, everything before 2009 was just that flat 8,000, right? So the taxable wage base itself was 8,000, which isn't to say taxes weren't rising or falling, because it could have been, there was a change in the schedule, right? Based on the health of the trust fund, the schedule could have migrated up or down, the tax rate schedule itself. But from that legislative change, you can see legislatively, it was actually changed from an $8,000 taxable wage base to 10,000 to 13,000 to 16,000. And then there were some parameters that prevented it from increasing until the loan was paid off, and then it started indexing. So now our fund does kind of the taxable wage base itself on a usual year just indexes up slightly.
So, as you can see, going back to the graph that Matt was referring to, we were in a very, positive position leading into the pandemic, which, helped us as a state weather through the pandemic, as we mentioned earlier, without having to borrow, without having to put any additional federal dollars into our unemployment trust fund. But what you can see is now we are at roughly a little less than half of where we were leading into the pandemic. So now our balance is around $250 million as opposed to, 519, which is I think where we were at leading up to the pandemic. There was a lot of changes that were made during the pandemic to expand unemployment insurance eligibility, and we kind of outlined some of those changes in the unemployment trust fund report as well, just to provide the committees with an understanding of kind of what was done. A lot of those emergency provisions have gone away, and we are kind of at this point back to where we were pre-pandemic, both with the level of unemployment, the number of individuals who are receiving benefits. We have gone back to tax schedule 1.
Bless you.
We returned back to tax schedule 1 this past July, and that's currently where we're at. And then Matt, I'll kick it over to you if you want to talk about our projections, kind of looking forward.
Sure. So we prepared 2 models. Pre-pandemic, we used to prepare 2 models. We'd prepare a standard baseline forecast, and then we prepare a recessionary forecast. During the COVID recession, it did not seem feasible or possible to produce a recessionary forecast, considering we were already in one. And we were still trying to get our arms around how bad of a recession it was. While it was extremely deep, it was shorter than some recessions, so that the recovery in particularly the unemployment rate, the number of people in the unemployment insurance claimant pool, that decreased back to pre-pandemic levels pretty quickly, much to our surprise. This has been a very different recession, and I can talk at length about how different this recession is versus the 2007 recession, as it is of interest to the committee either today or at another time. But sticking to today's topic, talking about the baseline forecast, in essence, we're talking about if we keep at this historically low level of unemployment, what does the fund look like? How does the fund respond? And if nothing else, it helps kind of ground us and illustrate in how the fund works, so that it does try to self-regulate itself through the tax rate schedules, through the adjustments to the taxable wage base. And you'll see that the charts and graphs just kind of show a slow, steady incline in the blue line, meaning the unemployment insurance trust fund balance.
Which page?
Oh, I'm sorry. 11. Thank you. Yeah, page 11, talking about the baseline forecast. I'm really focusing more on the graph. I like to think of economics as stories, and I know it can be very difficult to process all the information in charts and graphs at the same time. So hopefully the story is coming through and we can dive into the numbers as need be. But the story being in a steady state economy, what we'd expect is that contributions would slightly outpace benefits so that the fund would slowly accrue. On top of that, the fund does earn interest. So that is the other factor of why the fund continues to grow and grow and grow, because it does get interest on top of that significant cash. I call it significant because if I had to $250 million earning interest, I would call it significant. My own personal account. I mean, it is up to the committee to define if it's significant from a statewide perspective for the overall health of the economy. But yeah, those interest payments, they add up. It's a pretty good interest rate. It always has been. I think even last year's was like just under 2%, and they're projecting the years to come about 3%, even though we're in a higher inflation period of time for a non-risk return. So you can kind of see what happens. And then with the balance as it continues to accrue, for reader guidance, I included a chart at the bottom which just kind of shows approximately how much in the fund needs to be there for us to be at tax rate 1 versus tax rate 5. And this was a big discussion point, particularly during the COVID economic downturn, because there was some tough calls that had to be made about how much needs to be in the fund. What do we need to prepare ourselves for, considering that we were in the middle of that global health pandemic? So this forecast isn't as interesting because it doesn't show much, right? It's a steady state forecast, kind of leveling the lines out. If you switch to the next page on page 12, modeling a theoretical recession. And again, for the record, the Vermont Department of Labor is not predicting a specific recession at a specific time of a specific depth or severity. We're using this as an illustrative an illustration to kind of just detail how the fund would react to an economic downturn. But for those who are following current economic news, there's a lot of public discussion about whether we're going to be heading into a recession or not, and what are the signs of what are the signs or pluses and minuses of that could or could not occur. And even if we did, is it going to be deep or shallow? There's a lot of public debate. And so at least as a tool to kind of better understand how the fund itself will react to an economic downturn. Here you can see we've forecasted out just 2025, picking a year, 2 years out. That's historically what we've done pre-pandemic. We put a recession 2 years out for illustrative purposes. And you can see if we follow the red line, meaning the number of benefits paid, 2021 was a higher year because we were still coming out of that pandemic. 2022 and 2023 are setting themselves up to be historic lows in terms of the utilization in the fund. So if we put a recession in 2025, you see that spike in benefit payments going out. Ultimately, that's going to pull down your trust fund balance. And because I created a more illustrative recession, this is not as big as the COVID recession. This is not as big as the 2007 recession. This is more of a modest recession. If need be, we could model something bigger. But at least for illustrative purposes, wanted to show how the fund would react. And where it becomes of particular interest is if you look in the chart at the top, the fifth column over called tax rate schedule, you'll see that in 2021, we were at tax schedule 3. We migrated down to tax schedule 1 where we currently are. If we hit another recession, the fund says, oh goodness, we need more money in the fund to ensure that we can pay our bills going forward, kind of a rainy day fund. It jumps back up to schedule 3 where it stays for 3 years before the fund's health improves, ultimately pulling it down. And so you'll see at the bottom of that page, the table is actually different about how much would need to be in the fund to be determined a healthy fund. So the way the tax rate schedule, maybe I should pause there before I talk a little bit about the calculation itself.
Representative Demrow and then Anthony.
Just some nuts and bolts questions. I'm assuming that because it required legislative intervention in 2021, the tax rate schedule is set in statute. Is that right? So if the fund falls below a certain point, that triggers change. Is that correct?
There was a legislative change made. So the way the tax rate schedule calculation works in rough terms, it says, let's take a look at how much you have in the trust fund at the end of the year. Okay, we'll put that number aside. And then we're going to say, what is your historic utilization? Let's look at the worst year you've had in the last 10 years and then try and measure up how much you have in the fund versus what your worst year looked like. The legislative intervention that happened during the COVID recession, they said, we're going to allow you, Vermont Department of Labor, when you're doing this calculation, to ignore 2020. Because we were basically saying, so that would take us out of that 10-year window. So if we ignore 2020, we could then basically pick the second worst year and base our calculations off that. Absent that legislative policy, the fund wanted $1 billion, to get back to Schedule 1. And that, like, at that time was thought to be, well, that seems like a little too much in the fund. So it was determined that it would be, we could ignore 2020 in the calculation. So we still have that on the books. When we do our 10-year look back, we pick the worst year excluding 2020. So in any future recession, that's going to be our worst year. So that's why the 2025 number actually in terms of how much benefits were paid in 2025, the 135.8 million, you'll see that reflected in the table below, indicating how that's going to be our worst year going forward. And that's what we would look to drive the health of the fund.
Got it.
And so when we made that decision, it was a combination of it's sort of calling for more money than is needed. The jump in changing rates for employers would be sort of a lot
To ask for.
at
that
once,
point,
right? It was just like a
Sure,
big, because
understood.
generally the schedules are designed for some sort of flow between them, and this
Yeah.
was sort of a big leap. And then as part of that, there was also in statute to send out more money to claimants, which because of various IT systems and federal rules is being postponed until a magical future when the IT system works.
Yes. The legislature came back last year and did a little bit of a fix to that or a change to that, but we can deep dive on that if you want.
I can completely understand how 2021 might have needed some change to that. How the model wouldn't have worked.
As the chair was mentioning, we were going to go from Schedule 1 all the way to Schedule 5 in calendar year 2021 if there was no intervention, which for the majority of Vermont employers would mean a tripling of their taxes. And we were concerned at the time, legislature was concerned at the time, we're trying to come out of a pandemic and get individuals back employed as quickly as possible. And we were concerned about increasing the taxes by that much coming out of that. And so we removed 2020. That sent us to Schedule 3, which was still a significant tax increase for a lot of employers at the time. But it did allow us to hold at 3 for a year, and then we were able to go back down to Schedule 1.
And the second question is, where does the fund live? Does it live in the treasurer's office? Who invests it? Does it live at DOL or?
No, sir, it lives with the US Treasury,
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah.
and they do not invest it. So we can only access those dollars. There are very strict federal parameters around when we receive contributions from employers. We actually have timeframes that we have to adhere to upload, if you will, or transfer that money to the US Treasury's office. And then we draw down those dollars on a daily basis to pay benefits. And we can only draw those dollars down to pay benefits. We cannot use those dollars for anything else other than the payment of unemployment benefits.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Anthony, Representative Masson.
I pass, you covered it.
I would sort of say this is probably, for me, one of the most frustrating areas of statute to work in because of both the federal, there's charming staff, but the boundaries of the federal legislation and the federal rules and the IT system parameters make it really, I think, virtually impossible to create good policy.
And I can touch on that in just a second.
Yeah.
Good question, but absolutely.
And we would think that when things are running smoothly, the decisions on rates and schedules are supposed to be formulaic. But there are times when we, like 21, we say, oh geez, we need to, within what we're allowed to do, we need to make it a little easier on employers for good reason. And we recognize that we'll have to pay it back, so to speak, as we go forward. And there was some debate on the floor about that, but we settled where we settled, and it's a good thing we did.
So just for informational purposes, if I may real quick, Matt,
Please.
interject, for the committee and for those who may be listening. In 2021, when we came to the legislature and discussed the tax rate increase and the concerns, also within that legislation was a provision to include an additional $25 on everyone's unemployment insurance weekly benefit amount. if everyone remembers during the pandemic, at the onset of the pandemic, the federal government included an additional $600 in weekly benefits for people every week. That ended up being reduced and became $300 later in calendar year 2021. The thought at the time was add an additional $25. That was really the only way we could feasibly implement that with our mainframe limitations. When we went to implement, the federal government said you cannot implement it the way that we had intended to, because we intended not to include it, not to tax them and not to charge them to employers. There's a lot of technical things that we were not going to be able to do. The federal government came in and said you can't do it that way. So we were not able to implement the provision in the original manner that the legislature had passed. What then passed last session was a $60 increase to the maximum benefit amount. So this past July, we artificially increased the maximum benefit amount by an additional $60. And that will remain in place until a certain date in the future. As the chair was pointing out, when we have a modern system and we're able to go back to the $25 per weekly benefit amount for all claimants. So we can deep dive into that
Maybe even
further if you
something
want,
better.
but, or something better or different. But we can, deep dive into that if the committee would like. I know it is extremely frustrating for you all as policymakers. It is extremely frustrating for us as a department. When we come in, we talk about the limitations of our mainframe system and our inability to actually implement any changes in our system because of the concerns around the volatile nature of it right now.
Yeah, Representative. Forgive me if this is something that everyone in the room is already aware of.
I'm sure it's not.
What is the path forward with the mainframe system? Or is that like maybe we can come back and talk about that another day?
No, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I can give a very brief update and happy to answer any questions you have. The department has been trying to modernize our mainframe system for quite a long time. We have joined multiple different what are called consortiums of other states to try to modernize that were funded by federal dollars. Those were not successful for various reasons, and I'm happy to provide information to the extent you would like on decisions there. Where we're at now is the legislature has provided the administration with the funding necessary to modernize a full system. I believe it's $33.5 million is what we've been provided to date. So we have gone out for a request for proposal for a full system, full systems implementation. We have received those responses back. Our team is reviewing them currently, and we're hoping to select a vendor and be able to negotiate a contract and move forward this year. But the unfortunate thing is that still puts us at, potentially, depending on the vendor and depending on the time frame they're able to come back to us with, 2 to 4 years out, 2 to 5 years out of a full system modernization. Now, some of that will probably be in phases, but we're still quite a ways from having a fully modernized unemployment insurance system.
And can you just provide a small amount of context for folks who don't? I think, sometimes we think about modernizing, we think about a bad website. Can you provide a little bit of context about what we're modernizing from?
So the department operates the unemployment insurance program on IBM mainframe computer that the department, I believe, went live with. I think it was in the 50s or the 60s. Our unemployment insurance software runs in a software programming language that is out of date and no longer in use. It's called COBOL. I'm probably not the best person to speak to on this. You probably may want ADS in here to talk in a little bit more detail there if you're interested. But the reality is, our unemployment insurance system, both hardware and software, is extremely outdated. The concerns that we have are not having enough individuals with the technical expertise to continue to maintain it, And when we do make changes, it is extremely difficult to do so. So it's not a web-based system when you think about, right, it's not a bad website. It would be nice to be able to come in and just display the system and you could, to show everyone, but a little bit of context there.
I appreciate that, thank you.
Is this like an IBM 370 with card decks and things like that, or?
I think about it as like the size of this room and really hot.
And tape.
Yeah, so you've got a raised floor and you,
Well, so we do not house the mainframe itself anymore.
Oh,
That
really?
has-
But that was very recently.
That was within the past few years, yes, ma'am. We used to house the mainframe at the Department of Labor. That has been moved off-site to a third-party vendor that the Agency of Digital Services contracts with and supports.
But it's like, there's the little green line that flashes at the beginning. It's like,
there's a little green line.
with DOS-based programming where there's like the little green hyphen that flashes at the beginning before you start typing. It's like
It's all
that,
command-based and things like, yeah, okay. Nice.
just for like a little.
Until recently, I was still getting the green bar reports.
Yes.
That would just show up. You know?
Back to you, are there other things you wanted to cover in the report?
No, we at least did a quick pass through like the overarching mechanics of it, kind of where we think the fund is itself, how it would respond to a smaller type recession. The report itself does contain more information about utilization, what claims levels have looked like in the past couple of years. As I said, whether you're talking about unemployment insurance claims levels or benefit payments, the utilization of the fund is quite low right now. So from a historic standpoint, I saw the numbers today. So we're doing about 4,200 claims a week right now total. That's initial and continued claims. This is our busy season. So it wouldn't be unusual to have 5,000, 6,000 claims, active claims going on. And as I said, we're at 4,200. So on a week-to-week basis, the payment out is much lower than we've historically seen in the winter. We usually see $2 million out a week, and we're seeing about 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 million dollars out a week right now. So, we're down anywhere from 10 to 30% from historic lows now, setting new historic lows week to week in any. So that is a different context. So the fund is stable in that regard, and we're coming into our big cash positive time period because we're going to be seeing after the benefit claimants that there's a lot of seasonality to this work, right? So we know the winter is busy from a claimant, so payouts go out first quarter heavy. Because of our seasonal nature of our economy, and then as industries start up and start rehiring for spring and summer, but also the way the contributions work, it's on a quarterly basis, and that taxable wage base that we talked about, the first quarter is always the biggest one, and you get that money collected in end of April, early May. So we're always looking at what is our cash position coming out of quarter one, because we know in early quarter two, the fund will realize significant monetary contributions. The big money will hit, like anywhere from 50%, 60% of our annual collections will happen in late April, early May.
Yeah, I would say the reality is, leading into the pandemic where we were able to come to the legislature and say, we're in great shape. We have over $500 million in our trust funds, things are really positive. Again, we've weathered through the pandemic well, better than most other states, but I wouldn't exactly say the same thing today sitting in this chair. I think we're stable, but the concern being we don't know what is, right around the corners in regards to the overall health of the U.S. economy. And if we were to go into a recession, depending on, the economic circumstances of that, we are not in the position that I feel like we would want to be facing that. Depending on how USDOL measures it, We are not where USDOL would want us to be leading into any normal recession at this point.
Representative Bodie?
Well, how far out do you think a recession might be? Because I just read that we are not in a recession, nor are we going into one now.
I do not have the skills or the expertise to answer that question. I don't think, in our model, as Matt mentioned, I mean, we're not projecting one. But, the concerns that I think we have are as the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates, and then you see jobs reports like we had just for the last month, that was extremely very strong, not what was expected or projected. The concerns that will continue to lead to increased inflation and increased rate hikes from the US Fed. We don't know what that is going to, we don't know what the ultimate landing zone is there. People say that they're hoping for a soft landing, and some say there may be a hard landing. What we are seeing is we're seeing an uptick in layoffs. I think I saw this morning, there was a large company, it's escaping me, but was potentially laying off, Zoom, thank you, was laying off up to 15% of its workforce. And so we're continuing to see, large companies having significant layoffs. We're also seeing companies here in Vermont coming out of the pandemic leading up to, through most of 2022, we weren't seeing a significant number of layoffs here in Vermont. But I can tell you over the past few months, we've had multiple warn notices provided to the Department of employers that are laying people off in this state. And so, I don't think the department or the administration is going to sit here and say, we know one is coming. But I think the concern that we have is if one is, or if we get into one, are we in the position that we need to be? We are in a worse position now than we were leading into the last Great Recession, and we had to borrow from just a total dollar amount. We're in a better position in the sense that the legislature has set us up where the taxable wage base is higher, taxable wage base index is up. We weren't doing that leading into the last Great Recession, but from just a dollar amount of what is in the trust fund, we have less now than we did leading into that. So if we face another recession like we did in 7, 8, 9, beginning next year, would we potentially have to borrow? I don't know the answer to that, but it's possible.
Representative Andrews, Representative Beth.
Going back to your chart on page 9, it looks like actually heading into the 2007 period, we weren't in a stronger position than we are today. We were in a worse position. And that's not to say, I don't think we should be, I guess 2 things. One is, am I misunderstanding that? And 2 is to say also, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be fully funding this fund. I'm just trying to.
I would say we're at a roughly equivalent position. If you look at what I'm referring to, and we're going to, apologies, I'm going to geek out a little bit here. There is a specific measure that USDOL looks at to determine the adequacy of trust funds. One of them is called the average high cost multiple. And so what that means is it's looking at, similar to how Matt described how we set our tax rate schedule, you're looking at what's the balance of your trust fund versus what's your worst year in the past 10 years. USDOL will look at it and say, well, what are the average 3 worst years over the past 20 years? Or what are the average 3 last recessions? And what is your balance of your trust fund? And they come up with a formula and they give you a number. They would prefer states to be at a 1. Going into the pandemic, we were at a 2.5. So we were, again, one of the most adequately funded trust funds leading into the pandemic. We don't have their methodology for the end of calendar year 2022 because it's still the beginning of February. But last year, we were at a 0.8. Leading into the Great Recession, we were at a 1.3. So when I look at that, that's telling me that our trust fund going into that recession was in a better position than it is now. Granted, the calculation they were looking at wasn't considering or wasn't anticipating something like the recession that happened in 7, 8, 9. So the fact that 7, 8, 9 happened is probably dragging our number down a little bit. So, but it's just, from a numbers perspective, when you're looking at how they calculate the methodology, we're not in the same position we were in leading into the last recession. But it just depends on what a potential next economic downturn looks like. As Matt has, shown in the UI Trust Fund report that we have here, if you're looking at a mild recession or a moderate recession, we have enough money in our trust fund. It just depends on what that looks like.
And if you want a deep dive, there, the Unemployment Insurance Task Force did sort of a comprehensive look at all those ratios.
Got it.
And Damian Leonard did some nice drafting of that report that we can find.
And I should pause and allow our economist to say anything if he wants.
That's good.
Okay.
So are you trying to get back to 1 or 2.5 or like where do we get to where like you can sleep at night?
I can sleep at night now.
Okay.
I just, we're trying to be realistic that we're not where we were prior to the pandemic.
Okay.
And, I get concerned having gone through the pandemic, thinking about what is potentially around the corner and are we prepared for that, both with the amount of money that we have in our trust fund? Are we prepared for that with the staffing that we have? Are we prepared for that? That's what keeps me up at night a little bit. I'm not sitting here saying that we need to go raise taxes and put more money in the trust fund, the exact opposite. But I don't want to send the message that we're in the same position we were in 2019.
Representative Anthony.
Thank you. My question is the past really past in the sense that there was a period where this Vermont and the U.S. Keepers of the fund were in disagreement about clawbacks and what did you owe and so on. Is that behind us finally? And so the numbers we have are really the numbers we have control over.
I would probably need you to elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the clawbacks.
You gave money out that you shouldn't have gave. Give me a check.
Gotcha. So we, state of Vermont, had to do a lot of bending of the unemployment insurance eligibility rules during the pandemic to ensure that we were able to get money out the door to Vermonters. So at one point in time, USDOL was asking us to go back and re-adjudicate a lot of claims. For example, we were waiving certain eligibility issues to ensure that people were receiving benefits, and USDOL was asking us to go back and re-adjudicate those. And we took a pretty strong position with USDOL that we had no intention of doing that, and we haven't done that for a specific population of claimants. And we haven't had any, additional kind of pushback from USDOL in that regard. So I think we're potentially okay for certain issues that we waived during the pandemic. You also all may have seen in the news or heard from constituents, we are going back and having to do some eligibility reviews for PUA claimants, for example. And for those in the room, for those in the room or those listening, PUA is Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. That was one of the CARES Act programs that the federal government stood up through the states to provide unemployment to self-employed individuals, independent contractors, or individuals who were not otherwise eligible for regular unemployment insurance. part of that program is the individuals had to provide us with documentation to substantiate that they were employed or had self-employment. We have and are going back and doing some reviews on those claimants to ensure that they were properly eligible for that program. And we are reaching out to some of those individuals and asking them to provide us with documentation if they have not done so already. So that's a little bit of yes and no.
So that latter category is still an open book?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. I thought so. I just wanted to ask.
I would love, Mr. Barowitz, if at some point in the future you could come in and talk to us just a little bit more about sort of the demographics of the labor force, because we talk a lot about income taxes and wage labor and all those things, but putting some more numbers on that and sort of changes would be really helpful, but certainly not today. Just want to invite you back at some
Great,
random
happy
time in
to.
the future to do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to share with us before we close?
Excited to be back. Nice to see you all. And
Welcome to our new committee room.
always happy to come back and talk. Or, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us and happy to discuss further.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you.
We're going to start back up at 2:15 with